prep on exam AZ-301, Microsoft Azure Architect Design. My name's Tim Warner, happy to be with you. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Cloud and Data Center Management and a full-time Pluralsight author. We're going to spend an hour and 15 minutes together, and I'm going to help you make the most of it. Thanks for being here, by the way, especially at this time of day. I know firsthand how overwhelming things can be being with 28,000 people and session after session. So I'm deeply grateful to each and every one of you for being here. So I've given you 3 takeaways from this session. First, I want you to leave with more Azure knowledge, particularly Azure architecture knowledge, than you have now. Pretty clear. Second, I want you to have at least a leg up on skilling your hands-on experience with Azure, because although AZ-301 doesn't have performance-based labs in it as of this week, I'm told, it will very shortly in the future. So you want to be prepared fully on what that experience is like. And I've got lots of tips, tricks, and strategies to share with you over the next hour and change. And third, this is really never to be overlooked. There's knowing your content, there's knowing how to do the work, but there's also test-taking strategy. Over the years, I've met people who have gone into the exam room smiling and come out crying because they didn't pass the exam, not because they didn't have tons of hands-on experience, not because they even knew why they were clicking what they were clicking and the code that they were writing, why they were doing it, but they weren't prepared for how Microsoft is going to evaluate your knowledge and skills on their certification exams. So I've actually developed a study model over the last 20 years. I've been in Microsoft certification for a little over 20 years now. And I submit to you that there's 3 interdependent skills. One, as I said, no big surprise, it's understanding the theory. And our focus today is Azure architecture, classical architecture. One of the questions I'll answer, if you don't already have it for me, is which exam should you take first? You have to pass AZ-300 and AZ-301 to be successful. Does it matter which one you take first? What do you get if you just pass one of the 2 exams? And what's the difference between the 300 and 301 anyway? Practical application, you might think, I might make the argument, why would Microsoft put performance-based items in the architecture exam? Wouldn't that be best placed in the administration exam, AZ-103? And it is. There are performance-based labs there. This is what we've got going on. We have to be prepared for these hands-on labs, which is a good thing when you think about it. Test-taking skills rounds out the 3, okay? So a little bit on the move to role-based certifications. Who here holds the old MCSE in Windows Server or another platform product? Right. When I first got certified, it was 1998, I think. It was the Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer. And I know there are some issues about engineer. Wait a minute, what are you licensed? What kind of engineering are you licensed for? And around 2008, when Windows Server 2008 came around, there was the MCITP. Does anybody remember that? The Microsoft Certified IT Professional. Then Microsoft Learning realized that there's a lot of goodwill associated with those letters, MCSE, so they came back as Microsoft Certified Solutions Expert. And that's what you're seeing on the screen here. This is gone the way of the dodo. But the last Azure-related MCSE was the Solutions Expert in Cloud Platform. And I think the main issue that Microsoft Learning got from customers, from you and I, is that they asked too much for this. In order to earn this credential, you really had to have equally balanced skills in architecture, development, and, what's the third one? Administration. And that's a heavy lift, isn't it? Think of how large the Azure ecosystem is. So we're all here today looking at this, one of these new role-based certifications. In Azure family, there's several. In fact, the next slide will show just a few of them. And we're interested in this expert tier one called Azure Solutions Architect. So there's 2 things that are driving this role-based certification trend. One, for us to be able to more granularly describe our skills to your customers, to your boss, to a hiring manager for a future job, whatever the case may be. And there's also the shareability, the social media aspect, and I'll include that a little bit later in today's session. How easy it is to embed these badges, and they're verified too. It works somewhat similarly to TLS SSL, where you can embed those badges in your social media profile, in your online CV, whatever the case may be. And whoever it is that needs to verify your certification can click that and see that Microsoft is in fact validating that you have such and so a badge, which I think is a really nice thing. Now, in the Azure Applications and Infrastructure family, you see first at the fundamentals level, Azure Fundamentals. One exam, AZ-900. Next, we have the associate level where we start to break out into each of those different roles. Administrator, developer, architect is not on that list because architecture is considered an expert level. Now, some things to point out about this. The architect certification doesn't have any prerequisites to it. You just have to pass AZ-300 and AZ-301. If you decide to go back, so to speak, and qualify with AZ-900, that's a great thing. I'm a huge fan of the Azure Fundamentals skill set. In fact, I hope to see many of you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. down the hall, because I'm presenting one of these sessions on Azure Fundamentals. I think it's a great skill set for anybody whose job role touches Azure. But like I was saying, there's very few exams here that have a hard dependency. There's one, the DevOps Engineer Expert, you can see there, the little tree branching. In order to earn that particular badge, you have to have either the administrator or the developer as a prerequisite. But for what we're doing, for architect, you don't have to have any other certifications. It's just AZ-300, AZ-301, and you're good to go. Finally, there is a method to the way that these exams are ID'd. The Azure family are all AZ. What are the initials for the Microsoft 365 exams? Anybody know? MS, right. So there's a logic as far as that identifier goes. And Microsoft Learning is trying to somewhat standardize the numbering. I think they're using 900 to signify fundamentals level, which is kind of weird, isn't it? Normally you think a 101 being the entry level instead of 900, but I don't know. Greater minds than mine for sure. This is from the Microsoft Learning website. Just I highlighted what I think are the most important pieces, because I get asked by students quite a bit, well, are there academic or career prerequisites to earning the Azure Architecture badge? No, there isn't. You can come in right from college or secondary school. Heck, imagine a smart secondary school student could register for these exams. So what you're seeing here in the audience profile is just simply what Microsoft's experience is. So in our role as an Azure Solutions Architect, current or prospective, we're advising stakeholders, translating business requirements, we're picking out the appropriate Azure products to build solutions that meet whatever your requirements and limitations are. That's pretty true to life, I've found in my professional experience. But look at that third highlighted piece down at the bottom. You have to be proficient in Azure administration, development, and DevOps. So I bet you have a question. How much Azure PowerShell do I have to know to be successful on these architecture tests? Is that a question that any of you wondered maybe? Or will these exams have Azure command line interface? Will I see C#? I'm going to answer those. I should have asked. I think these mics are live, by the way. Although it's a big group of people, I'm here to answer your questions. So if you want to ask a question, come to the appropriate microphone, whatever is nearest. Otherwise, I'll be around after the session. I'm happy to answer any questions you have at that time as well. Okay, so looking at this slide here, this has just given us some additional granular detail on each of those exams. I want to address the common question, what's the difference between AZ-300, which is called Azure Architect Technologies, and AZ-301, which is Azure Architect Design, I think it's called. The way I describe it is that AZ-300 is an architecture exam, but it skews more towards the administrator job role. In other words, if you take AZ-300, you can fully expect to get a couple of those performance-based labs where you're doing hands-on stuff in the Azure portal. So I think it's more of a architecture and implementation together kind of skill set. By contrast, AZ-301, what we're studying together today, I describe it as architecture more skewed towards development. No, you're not going to see C# code. Yes, you will see Azure PowerShell. You may see a little Azure CLI. and you might yet see a little KQL. Does anybody know what KQL is? Kusto Query Language, part of Azure Monitor Log Analytics. That Microsoft Learning's been sneaking little tiny bits of it into the exam. I mean, let's face it, the whole shift of Operations Management Suite into Azure and the journey of Azure Monitor and Log Analytics and it changing its name every week. I was told by Liberty Munson from Microsoft Learning yesterday, I wanted to get verification from her, that her team goes through these exams on a 2-month cycle. So, including the labs, she said they go through every item every 2 months to make sure that the content is current. And I'll have more to say about that in terms of strategy a bit later. Let's see, any other questions? I think I addressed this one about the differences. Does exam order matter? Has anybody passed or at least taken AZ-300? Wow, a good deal of you. Good for you. And I would imagine anybody taken AZ-301 this week or is going to take AZ-301 this week? Imagine that's going to bring you to this session, right? Good deal. Yeah, the order I submit, this is just my own opinion, is completely up to you. As I said, thinking about what I said a moment ago, where 300 is more of an implementation architecture exam, and 301 is a bit more cerebral, is a more practical exam, that, I think, should give you a heads up. It doesn't matter. You get a badge for each one, which is kind of cool, but you need to have cleared AZ-300 and 301 in order to earn your architect badge. Okay, I think I answered this one as well. 301 doesn't have performance-based labs in it yet, but it will. Questions? Anybody brave enough to ask a question in this big room at this point? Don't say I didn't offer you the chance. These mics are up here as well. Okay, so now it's time for us to put our Azure Architect's caps on and start to dive into the content specifically. What are some tips, tricks, strategies concerning the subject matter of AZ-301? Microsoft Learning calls this first level of the outline their objective domain, or OD. So you can get all of this at the exam page, and I'll tour that page with you momentarily. But what I want you to see there is that Microsoft Learning breaks down each of those OD sections by percentage. And they really do indeed follow these percentages. So the exam page at the Microsoft Learning website definitely needs to be your source of truth for how you'll be assessed, I should say, on the test. Now, those percentages aren't really helpful in this case, are they? Because they're all pretty much even. On some exams, like AZ-900, for instance, there's one OD that is a bit bigger than the others. And then again, as a student, you think, well, I better put a little extra study time on that, you see? Here's an important tip I've found in my practice. Make an outline and map it to your calendar. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, as I said, every one of these exams has a page at the Microsoft Learning website. This is the AZ-301 one. And the most important part of this page I submit is skills measured, which is what we're doing right now. And look here. Microsoft Learning tends to change how they present the page from time to time, but right now you can get a PDF representation of all of the objective domain categories. And what I recommend all my students do is copy and paste all of that into, say, an Excel spreadsheet. So I think I've got that on another tab. Let me see. Yeah, so here's what the document looks like. The top level are the top level categories, the objective domain categories. Then there's second level headings, and then we get down to individual granular skills. And I think it would be a good idea for you to separate each one of those on a separate row in your table. So you've got first, second, third level headings. And put every one of those on a separate row. And I want to encourage you to make sure as you're preparing to pass the exam, you're comfortable with every one of those bullet points, because every one will show up on your exam in one way or another. Now you might think, Tim, this thing doesn't have 200 questions, does it? No, I think it's got like 40 to 50, something like that. But you're going to see every one of those bullet items appear somewhere, maybe in a case study. It'll be mentioned as part of a technical requirement. Or maybe there's an item where an incorrect choice, a distractor as it's called, references that. So it'll show up there somewhere, some way is what I'm trying to get across to you. So I find that if you create a nice spreadsheet of those and then take your calendar, think about what your time frame is for passing the exam. Now here in Microsoft Ignite, it's probably a compressed timeline if you're going to take it this week. But if not, I know that the voucher that you all received is what? It's got a 6-month lifetime, which is pretty generous, it seems to me. Think of your registration date. I submit that you actually go ahead and register and get the date on your calendar, and then work backward on your spreadsheet and just make each line item associated with the date on your calendar. Those, I think, should help give you a kickstart on developing a workable prep outline. All right, so the first objective domain category is called Determine Workload Requirements. Some of these get a little bit vague, let's be honest. There's no question about it. So what I would suggest to you to do is do a good Google or Bing search for AZ-301 study guide, because there are several good community members who have gone through every one of these line items and found appropriate docs articles. A couple of them I've been wanting to meet for a long time. There's a guy named Richard Hooper. He goes by Pixel Robots. You're not in the room, are you, Richard? It's tough to meet people when there's 28,000 people running around, but he's got a study guide at his website, Pixel Robots, where he does just that. He puts a docs link to every single line item in the blueprint, and that can be extraordinarily helpful. All right, so what do we have here? I've decided to call out some of the major points on the blueprint just to give you a heads up. With regard to consumption, the exam's going to be asking you questions about governance, Azure governance. How can you help a business organize their cost centers with taxonomic tags? So you need to know what taxonomic tags are, how to create them and implement, and in this case, through the cost management blade in the Azure portal, you can actually create reports that are organized by taxonomic tags. Another feature that the engineering teams seem particularly fond of is alerts. There's a lot of questions about Azure alerts and action groups, not only on the architecture exams, but the administrator and the developer ones as well. Sometimes I wonder what happens behind the scenes. Maybe the engineering team with alerts took the Microsoft Learning people out to lunch a bunch of times. I have no idea. But you have to understand how those work. And then more classically with Azure governance, we have Azure policy. In fact, that's shown on the next slide here with auditing and monitoring strategy. This has an important call out, and that is, what do you do about preview features? You know, whenever you see a feature that has preview after it, here's an important certification study tip that came to me from Liberty herself at Microsoft. They do not write questions on public preview features. Tip. So when you're in here and you're studying, you're auditing and monitoring, just stick with what's on the objective domain. Don't read into it. That's another important tip generally with any IT certification exam. I hate to say this way, maybe I should whisper it, but don't read too much of your experience into the exam items. I sometimes say that the exams sometimes will come down to, I know that the Microsoft docs say this, and my experience says that. What should I do? If you're given that case, go with the Microsoft answer. Okay? All right, know a bit of KQL. I've already mentioned this. I've got a separate slide where I actually have a suggested breakdown in terms of how much effort you should put in with PowerShell and Azure CLI. Log analytics is a big deal, and I'm a huge fan of that platform, actually. If you don't know what Azure Monitor Log Analytics is, it's essentially a data warehouse where you can send your Azure resources, have them send their logs and telemetry data into it. And then Microsoft developed this Kusto query language that looks a lot like SQL, looks a lot like the Splunk SPL. It's a good language to know, I submit it, as an Azure Architect developer or administrator. And you might see an item where a case study or a scenario in an item has a statement there. You know, you won't be writing any code, you'll be interpreting code on these exams. Even the developer exam, just if you're interested, FYI, the AZ-203, unless they've changed something with the performance-based labs, you're just interpreting code and not actually writing it. Too hard to grade. The next section is called Design for Identity and Security, and some of the big call-outs here, this is a big one, authentication. What are the hallmark to-study things there? Number one, Azure AD Connect all day long. The question of hybrid identity. You've got cloud applications that rely on Azure Active Directory for authentication, and you want to give your on-premises Active Directory domain services users single sign-on. So we need to understand the workflow for deploying Azure AD Connect. You also need to know how to do a highly available Azure AD Connect implementation using what's called staging mode. The other bit about authentication are the single sign-on or SSO flows. A lot of those, you know that huge library of integrations that in your Azure AD tenant, Microsoft has cooked up like 3,000 or something SSO flows that go to different software as a service platforms like Concur, Dropbox, AWS. Those are really nifty, and they're good to know about. So you need to understand things like application registrations, how to give permissions or authorization to users of a web application that uses Azure AD. That's why I said that this AZ-301 skews architecture more to a development side than to an administrator side. Speaking of authorization, this screen from the Azure portal shows the good old access control IAM blade. So here we're talking about role-based access control, or RBAC. Specifically, what do you need to dive into with RBAC for your AZ-301 exam? You need to be familiar with the major built-in roles, and you need to understand how to create a custom role. You will see a lot of JavaScript object notation, or JSON, on your exam, which should make sense given that that's how every single deployment in Azure is written and defined. As far as the built-in roles, you know that there's a lot of them, right? From the subscription level, there's owner, contributor, reader, but then there's that humongous list of built-in roles. Do you need to memorize those? I would say absolutely not. You certainly need to know about owner, contributor, and reader. But then I think that if you think about it like I do, that pattern of owner, contributor, reader is really most of those other built-in roles. You'll see there's logic app contributor, virtual machine contributor, so you don't have to think about memorize. So if you get an item on your 301 exam where it gives you a problem and then the solution is to make such and so a member of this contributor group, number one, you don't have to think to yourself, is this one of those bogus things where Microsoft is referencing a non-existent technology? Like instead of logic app contributor, it would say logic flow administrator. Microsoft Learning will never put bogus or non-existent stuff on the exam. They'll always have options that are plausible and refer to existing technologies. Okay, so I hope that helps a little bit with the RBAC stuff. Minimal memorization needed, really. It's more of an experiential thing. How about data? This is a big subject, isn't it? And I know that Microsoft Learning had to tread carefully here in terms of scope because it can get so big. They took a lot of the data, the big data stuff. You're not going to have to worry about HD Insight and Hadoop and Databricks and that kind of stuff. Here it's more close to the historical relational versus non-relational. As you can see in the screenshot, if you search the Azure portal for database, number one, you need to know what's available. That's really a theme, I would say, that goes through AZ-300 and 301. As an architect, being able to understand, listening to a client or customer's problem, thinking about the Azure products that are most appropriate to meet that solution and how to compose them, how to put them together in a meaningful way that's cost-effective, performant, secure, et cetera, et cetera. So understand and know what's available relationally and non-relationally. Non-relationally, most of the time, the roads lead to Cosmos DB, don't they? And the second thing is just understanding the marquee features of each platform. So you might have a case study where the problem that they're trying to solve you feel could be solved by Cosmos DB, so that might be one answer. And then you might see another item that asks you about which consistency level you might want to choose. So you have to just think a little bit deeper about Cosmos, think that it has 5 different data consistency levels, and just think about that, map it to the problem, and go from there. Yeah, there's a lot on the exam for sure. I guess that's why it's considered to be an expert level certification. This is a very popular theme I've found on AZ-301. The notion of the event-driven architecture. And these can be a lot of fun, I think, to analyze, but maybe it's just me. The notion of events triggering a cascade of data movement. So this picture I borrowed from the Microsoft Docs. By the way, you can see the attribution URLs in the lower left corner. So this one, the example shows a single-page application that, depending upon what events are transpiring in that application, maybe there's an upload functionality, and if a file is uploaded by a user, that serves as a trigger that trips off a function. And that function might place the upload in a blob storage container, and that placement of the item in the container might trip off another function. So again, I like puzzles, so I like this idea of designing data flows. So to be successful on your exam, you have to understand what each of those products is, a little bit about functions, a little bit about blob storage, event grid, Cosmos, etc., and understand what's going on to get from point A to point B. How about business continuity? Wow, another huge subject that has some, well, let me just teach it. It has some hazards here. On the left part of the screen, we see classic disaster recovery, backup and failover replication. So you need to understand and know how to work with Azure Backup to back up, restore individual VMs, individual disks. But the real focus, I think, on AZ-301 is Azure Site Recovery, part of the Recovery Services Vault, where we can back up VMs at scale, restore at scale, and also configure failover replication. That's one side. The reason why I paused is because you and I both know of this thing called Azure Migrate. It's a great product. I love how they're collapsing what was just all these separate products. They're coming into this single platform, but I didn't see anything on the outline, correct me if I'm wrong, yet that mentions the words Azure Migrate. So as a teacher, it's hard for me to formally suggest you go one way or the other, but let me suggest that you study not only Azure Site Recovery as a disaster recovery tool, but you also look at Azure Migrate platform. Specifically, we're looking at different ways to use Azure Migrate. There's server migration, there's data migration, there's database migration. All of those tools are accessible from within Azure Migrate. High availability leads us into thinking of, as this diagram shows, how do we keep applications running on VMs or virtual machines up in the event of a planned or unplanned failure? There's the old chestnut on all of the Azure exams. Microsoft wants to make sure you understand the difference between availability zones and availability sets, when you would choose either of those. Another would be putting a virtual device in front of, say, a web front end, deciding between an Azure load balancer and an application gateway. On the 300 exam, you might be asked in a performance-based lab to troubleshoot an issue with an application gateway device, whereas on 301, you might be just asked to define when you would use App Gateway instead of, say, the load balancer. Again, that's that slight shift of lens between AZ-300 and 301. And then ultimately, from a geo high availability standpoint, you need to understand when to use and a bit of how to use Azure Content Delivery Network, CDN, Traffic Manager, and again, it's one of those shifty things like Azure Migrate, the question of front door, if you're familiar with the Azure Front Door service. Even if it doesn't appear on the outline, that product is so far along in its life cycle, I think you should be safe to include that service in your study plan, when you might choose front door as opposed to using the separate components like Traffic Manager and App Gateway and CDN. You with me so far, I hope? All right. Next, we've got design for deployment, migration, and integration. All right. Yeah, well, here we're talking about migration specifically. And this diagram, again, it comes from the documentation, shows the workflow for Azure Migrate, which, again, I'm a huge fan of, particularly in the server migration platform. You might see a case study that has a bunch of on-premises VMware virtual machines, and you're going to be asked questions about what you need to do. Do you need to deploy an appliance or not? Do you have to deploy an agent or not? These things will come into your analysis as you're going along. You can expect to see a number of case study items on the test. And I think that of all of these exams, the architect is the best one to have case studies, because what does a real solutions architect do but work in that kind of environment? So we're talking about server migration basics. We're talking data migration. You might even see a question or two about larger scale data migration where you want to use import-export service and or data box. I wouldn't be and, I guess it would be import-export service or data box. And then even database migration to tie into our earlier point when we were talking about the relational versus non-relational data products. Feeling a bit overwhelmed, or are you good? Are you? Okay. Designing an infrastructure strategy. Aha. Yeah. Microsoft told me a while ago, I'm sure that it's still valid, that the majority of their support requests, their Azure customer support requests, come not from compute, not from storage, but networking. Networking, let's face it, is a heavy lift, isn't it? Regardless of your job role. It depends on your experience, of course. But yeah, you have to be pretty clear on what's going on in this topology diagram, for instance. The fact that our virtual machines networking stack doesn't take place in the context of the VM resource, but the network interface resource. You have to be comfortable with the usage of managed disks. Some of the things you can do with managed disks for your VMs. The Azure Disk Encryption, for instance, the ADE, the full disk encryption. With storage accounts, there's the question of customer managed keys using Azure Key Vault. Being aware that this stuff exists is the main thing. So if you're seeing a theme like I'm starting to see develop a little bit with AZ-301, you're thinking of knowing the products, knowing a few key features about the products, and knowing a bit about how they're implemented. And that third point would cover the case of those dreaded performance-based labs. Anything else about storage account? I don't think so for now. Questions, comments, concerns, curiosities? You got to have something for me. Jeez. Okay, well, let's turn our attention to the meta subject of how to prepare. Let's get more into the weeds in terms of practical, click, 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 I passed kind of things, how that workflow works and my best suggestions for you. Forgive me for the smallish text on these slides, especially for those who are sitting in the back. I'll call out what I think are the major points here. Doesn't really matter how many questions exactly, 40 to 60, but the main point I want to get across to you here, and this has been the case for a few years with Microsoft exams, is that you are awarded partial credit. There was a time when, you'd have an interactive item that required you to drag and drop a bunch of stuff. You still have those, but it was all or nothing, and that's not cool. So you do get partial credit for both the interactive items as well as the multiple choice items, and even for the performance-based labs as well. So that leads me to the suggestion of never ever leave a question unanswered. If you're running really short on time and you realize you're not going to be able to give full time to the remaining questions, really, guessing is better than nothing, because if you guess, at least you'd have a percentage above zero of answering the question correctly, okay? Yeah, marking items for review is something else. The Microsoft Learning team are pretty darn responsive and open to feedback. So you have an opportunity, and if you've already been there, done that, thank you for bearing with me as I'm explaining this. You have the ability to mark items for feedback. If you feel that an item was unclear or off base, definitely send that as feedback. And somebody from Microsoft Learning should get back to you via email in all likelihood. And who knows what that could result in. It could result in a voucher. I hope you wouldn't want to have to do a retake, but you're helping Microsoft in that regard at any rate. As far as what you should plan for time-wise, 180 minutes, which I believe is 2.5 hours. There's some bumper time before and after that 2.5 hours. The bumper time before is there's a little tutorial that you can click through if this is your first time taking a Microsoft exam. And the bumper time at the end is for you to leave feedback, questions, comments, that kind of stuff. So it's a pretty good chunk of time. Important tip I have for you in that regard, it's a single timer that goes throughout the entire exam session. So that means you need to be consciously budgeting your time. Why do I say that? Well, because there's different kinds of items on the exam. You'd be cooking along doing multiple choice items, just happy as can be, and then boom, you're bumped into a case study. A case study is called a testlet. It's a test inside of a test. So you click into the case study and you work on it, and when you leave the case study, you can't come back to it either. You can only go back and forth among certain types of questions, predominantly multiple choice and interactive items. But it's a single timer, same thing. After the case study, you're chugging along doing single questions, and then boom, you might go into a performance-based lab. Not this week, according to Microsoft, but eventually for 301. And while you're in the performance lab, the timer is just kicking along, and when you leave the performance-based lab, you can't go back to that either, so you want to make the most of your time and effort while you're in it, okay? So that's the rundown with that. More than multiple choice, right. You know, you've got your traditional single answer multiple choice, multiple answer multiple choice, lots of different interactive items. One popular one that you might be familiar with is build, list, and reorder. Does that ring a bell? I know it's got to, especially those of you who raised your hand for the MCSE. Those are really popular on these exams, where you're given some scenario, or normally it would be a task, and then you have to drag the steps or elements from one side of the screen to the other and put them in the correct order. It's been around for a long time. I have a pro tip on that. You can take the exam either on your own computer in your home and office, or you go to a Pearson VUE testing center. If any of you follow my Twitter account, you know that I've complained about this in the past. But at a testing center that has monitors that are not very big, you're going to have a tough time getting through the exam. Really, it's a problem. It can be a problem. I would imagine, I haven't gone in the certification lounge here yet. Are the monitors and computers nice here, for those of you who have taken an exam this week? Yes. Oh, wow, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, so you want to do some due diligence if you're going to go to a testing center where you live. Because I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and it's just out of sheer habit. I keep going back to this place, but it's so obvious that their emphasis, the training center's emphasis on their testing center is bottom of the barrel. Because those monitors are CRT, non-widescreen monitors. Seriously. And here's the best part, I looked down at the tower case and it had a 3.5-inch floppy drive in it. I'm serious. So what's that tell you about, well, whatever, that's another subject. So you want to make sure, do everything you can that you've got a good size monitor to reduce having to move scroll bars. And for those performance-based exams particularly, you don't want to be trapped like I was, trying to get through creating, say, a storage account, let's say, in the Azure portal. And I couldn't scroll the inner window because the performance-based labs, you're given kind of a split view. I'll show you a slide of it shortly. And long story short, I wound up having to count tab stops, hoping I got to the OK so I could submit the deployment. It wasn't fun at all. All right, and more about case studies. I'm going to save further discussion on that because I have a separate slide on case studies. OK, here was that performance-based testing slide I told you about. That image there looks very similar to the real performance-based testing environment that you'll see. You won't see it this week on 301, as I keep saying, but you're bound to see it eventually in your Azure exams. So as I said, when you get to a performance-based lab, you have to click into it. You can't put it off. And once you leave it, you can't go back to it either. So what do you do once you go into it? You breathe. What happens is the screen splits kind of in 2/3/1/3. On the right, you've got a task list. And you can complete that task in any order you want. They're totally independent little ditties, little blurbs. And each one has a checkbox control just to help you keep track of what you've finished and what you haven't. And in the left part of the screen, you've got what I presume is a Docker container that's running the Edge browser. And I got a pro tip from a student that I wanted to pass on to you. If you feel more comfortable doing these tasks in, say, Cloud Shell, to use Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI, you can do that. I got verification from Microsoft Learning that you don't have to use the graphical portal to do performance-based labs. You can use Cloud Shell, no problem. It doesn't matter. It's the end result that they grade. The pro tip from my student says that containerized instance of Edge, of course, is multi-tab. So it'll kick you first to portal.azure.com, and the exam will give you credentials to log in as, your student ID and password. You can open up another tab and go to shell.azure.com and log into Cloud Shell, because you know there's some time to spin up that container, a container inside a container. And so it just is a tip that you'll have that off to the side that you can always flip back to. It takes a little while to get that environment spun up, and I remember on my exams there was some message that said that this part, the spin up of the lab, doesn't count against that timer, your overall 2.5-hour timer that I mentioned earlier. So take that for what it's worth. Normally there's 2 of these per exam. Could be 1, could be 0. Of course, you won't know till you get there. Questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, you were louder, so I'm going to call on you first.
So, maybe sorry to say this, but when I was taking 300, Edge was going really, really slow, and I actually closed Edge and opened Chrome on the container, and if I didn't do that, there's no way I would have finished the exam. Edge was just cycling, so another little tip.
Did you hear that? When he got to the performance-based lab, Edge was hanging so much, he was able to close it. And what boggles my mind is, how did you get Chrome running?
So I was surprised to see that it was actually on the OS, and I was able to browse to it without.
Whew. I dare say that that was non-standard. Wow.
I also get sometimes the initial browser that is open immediately after you start the lab, it doesn't allow you to log into Azure subscription. So don't
Right.
just open new window and use the same credentials to roll.
That's correct. That tip, the question was about credentialing. You know, you'll get on the little sidebar there. In fact, there's a button that says student credentials or username, password. You use those credentials to log into the portal, and if you open another tab to go, say, to shell.azure.com, you would use those same student credentials. There was somebody on this side who had a question. Is that right?
Yeah, so I had a problem with one of the tasks in the lab today for the 300, and actually I had the same lab with the same problem on the 103. So is there a way to leave feedback for one of the lab tests? Because when I did feedback with 103, I had to click through every single of the 61 questions, and that was a nightmare. I didn't want to do that today. I had enough of my time wasted. But basically the lab, I couldn't do one of the tasks because I had a problem with, I won't go into the details, but I wanted to leave feedback, but wasn't sure how to do it on a lab question.
Okay. Yeah, I think my suggestions would be, if you're really interested in leaving the feedback then and there, I would leave it associated with any item and say, I'm actually talking about the performance lab, literally that. But after the lab, you can always submit item challenges and feedback directly to Microsoft Learning. Let me do a live search here for Microsoft Exam Cert Policies. Yeah, this is a page that you should bookmark. It's called Certification Exam Policies and FAQs. And that's where they have challenging a Microsoft exam. They've got their contact info and instructions if you run into issues. Actually, another pro tip that's related to this is that you have to ask yourself, is the issue with the exam content or the exam engine? If it's the engine, that's a Pearson VUE question as opposed to a Microsoft Learning question. Okay? And they have, when I say they, Pearson VUE has their own page that I want to make sure you're aware of. We could do a search, for instance, for Pearson, come on, Pearson VUE exam grievance. Microsoft. I'm a good speller, aren't I? Yeah, it's on grievance policy. Here it is. Yeah, so again, just to keep in mind, Pearson VUE is the company that Microsoft has partnered with that delivers the exam. So if it's an exam engine issue, that would be a Pearson VUE issue. If it's an exam content issue, that would be Microsoft Learning. Question?
Yes, actually, I just took the exam this week. I do have a few things I want to share. First, I think the entire exam time is 10 minutes.
Oh, 2 hours, 10 minutes.
It's included the comments, whatever. The real exam is 180 minutes. Okay. And the second thing is, yeah, the performance lab. Even in this testing center, they give you a white screen. But when you have your question on this side and your real login to the Azure, when you strap, it's very difficult. What happened to me is when I click the drop-down menu, I want to choose the IP address for my load balancer thing. It disappears. It's very hard for you to continue click to find it. And yeah, the third thing is the timing. It's very confusing. I mean, for the testing, you have multiple choice, right?
Right.
And you have a case study, and then you have a lab. But the question, some question before lab, some question after the lab. So when you're in the lab, okay, at the first part, when you're in the multiple option, you are very clear where you are. You still have how many questions. But once you go into the lab, let's say you have 15 questions in the lab, and you're in the middle, you don't know, but it didn't show you, say you're in the question 30 or total 60 something. So when you finish the lab, then it pop up, you still have a bunch of questions there.
Okay.
And there is no time for you to.
Sure. Thank you for all that. That's valuable info. That last piece in particular I want to expand on, and that is when you're starting your exam, like I said, we're chugging along doing some multiple choice exams. It might say you're on question 3 of 48. And then you dump into a case study, and suddenly it says question 1 of 5. I think that's what he's talking about. That's in keeping with what I said, that the AZ exams have these testlets. The case study is an exam inside an exam. It's kind of self-contained. And the same thing with a performance-based lab. So once you come out of the testlet and you're on the main trunk of the exam, to draw a Git analogy, that's the one that'll say you're on question X of 48 or whatever the case may be. Come on, clicker. Oh, I need to switch my screen, of course. There we go. All right, yeah, this slide is going to answer the question to the best of my experience where I suggest you focus in terms of API, specifically how to do this stuff that Microsoft wants to validate you on. I would suggest that your split be 60% portal. So it's the majority Azure portal. If you're going to see something on your exam by way of an exhibit or an illustration, in likelihood it's going to be something from the portal. Same with those performance-based labs, you're by default in the portal. So that, I think, should be 60. I'd say 20% PowerShell, because let's face it, deploying a VM or an Azure SQL database once, twice, 3 times is fine in the portal, but how about if you need to do 100? To do things at scale, we're going to be working with JSON templates. We're going to be working with Azure PowerShell. So you can expect a fair amount of PowerShell. Now, it used to be years ago it was just enough to identify a commandlet. It's gone beyond that. I like to recommend that you have late beginner, but preferably early intermediate level skill with PowerShell, because you're going to see variables, you're going to see maybe a hash table or two, you'll see an if statement, you'll see more than just a simple commandlet. It's not like the old days where it was just enough to know a commandlet. So I strongly encourage you, you might have been putting it off for a while, to get proficient with PowerShell, get fairly proficient with PowerShell, because you'll be asked to interpret on the exam, specifically Azure PowerShell. The CLI, or the Azure Command Line Interface, has been really slow in all of the Azure exams. By slow, meaning almost non-existent. I'd love to know why. I don't have a non-NDA answer to that question. But I would say be aware of the Azure CLI. Play with it enough to where if you see an Azure CLI statement, you have a good idea of what it's doing. I'd say that if you're at that level with Azure CLI, you should be good to go. I mentioned the Kusto query language a few times. Again, you might see one statement on your exam, you might see none, but I'm putting there to hedge my bets. And again, because everything in Azure is JSON, you're just about guaranteed to see lots of JSON, whether it's an Azure policy definition or a resource manager template. You'll be given the JSON to look at, and you need to understand what the heck's going on with it. What are some other issues? Oh, this is meta. The USD price is 165 bucks. The localization at this point is English, Japanese, simplifies Chinese and Korean. Number of questions, time limit, 2 hours, 10 minutes. Thanks for that adjustment. Mentioned that earlier. For the exam, and the remaining 20 would be the before and after bumper that we were talking about. The passing score is always a question. It's 700 out of 1,000, but it's not 70%. There's all sorts of fancy magic, supposedly, that goes into Microsoft's algorithm of determining pass and fail. But the good news for you, I hope, is that it is pass-fail. And if you get 700 and just barely squeak by, you know, hooray for you. If you get 1,000, hooray for you. I've never once been asked for my score. Have you? I hope not. So a 700 and 1,000, for all intents and purposes, I think are pretty identical. That Microsoft certification exam policies and FAQs page that I showed you about 10 minutes ago, that also includes important information about retake. The idea with retake is that you have to wait at least 24 hours ahead of your first exam attempt before you do your second attempt. And then there's some rules beyond that. I think you can't take the exam more than 5 or 6 times in a calendar year. But the first retake that I want you to be aware of is just a 24-hour waiting period. See if I can add any additional detail on the exam delivery. I know it's different this week because we have the certification center. But when you go back home, the question of whether to go to a testing center where you'll have your forms of ID, you get your picture taken. I mean, it can be convenient in terms of you can just drive there or walk there or take the bus or train there and then come back. But the issue there is researching the exam PCs, as we previously discussed. Has anybody taken a Microsoft Cert exam with remote delivery? Was it a good experience?
It was. The one thing that I found a bit of a pain in the ass was you can't take any notes.
Right. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. What he said was that he did do remote delivery, where you can take the exam from your home or your office, but what a bit of a pain, though, is that you couldn't take notes. You know, I was asked this last week, and again, I keep hammering Microsoft Learning with my questions. They told me that the remote delivery engine has an electronic whiteboard. So there's evidently a tool on the screen, so you can take notes. But it's true, when you're doing remote delivery, you can't take a break, you can't take a bio break, or you can't get a drink, or that ends your session. You don't have a physical whiteboard like you do when you go in a testing center. So there are some concessions to that convenience of taking the exam remotely. Question?
Yeah, and also you cannot attach a secondary monitor.
Right. Oh, boy. The one and only time I've done remote delivery, I was totally unprepared. The Microsoft Learning site makes you download a little system evaluation check. I'm thinking, everything's great, rock and roll. But it took us like 45 minutes to get to where the exam loaded, because the proctor that you're working with, you've got your webcam and you're working with a live proctor, has you turn your webcam around to scan the whole room. And I have like 4 monitors. So I'm like, are you serious? I've got to power and unplug them. There's family pictures. I've got to take them off the wall. By the time we were finished, I thought a tornado went through my office. Wow, in that, well, there's more to the story, but yeah, I wasn't pleased with that first attempt, sir.
You don't have to do all the stuff with the camera anymore. You can just take a picture with mobile.
Nice, thanks for that update. So using a mobile phone rather than your camera, you don't have to do a sweep, you just take pictures?
Take 4 pictures of your room or whatever are you think the exit.
Very nice tip, I like that. Okay, I'll have to keep that in mind.
ID with mobile just confirm that everything is done and then you wait for a session.
I like that. Okay. Yeah, because what I've come down to, and from what I've been told, is essentially it's best to make a dedicated exam area in your home or office. I was thinking of literally taking a laptop and a tray table into a closet or something, for heaven's sake. So there's nothing but, but fabric around me. All right, so there's that to consider. Let's see, anything left out about that? I don't think so. This slide brings up some options for skilling up, both in terms of the theory and the hands-on practice. Here, these are just really some ads more than anything else. The main point I want to draw on this slide is for you to take the time to determine what your best learning style or learning styles are. Maybe you're really good just studying on your own with a book or in the Azure documentation. Maybe you're best when you're working with a live instructor and other people where you can bounce ideas off them and get answers to your questions. I strongly suggest you, A, think about how you learn most efficiently, and then make your training choice accordingly. So specifically, some tips along those lines would be the Microsoft Learn site, which I think is a fantastic resource. Any of you gone through any of the content at MS Learn? I'll tell you what's so especially cool about it. Let me flip on over to my browser again. And it's at Microsoft.com, no surprise there, Learn. You sign in with your Microsoft account, and there's a gamification aspect where you can earn points and challenges. That's always kind of cool. They redid the page layout completely for Ignite, so I'm kind of all thumbs here. But there's learning paths based on job role. And sure enough, there's an Azure Solution Architect job role path in there with over 100 modules, all free, really. And here's the coolest thing yet that you may or may not be aware of. Not all, but some of those lab modules allow you access to a sandbox Azure environment. So you're not burning your own credit, your own pay-as-you-go subscription. You're logging into the Azure Cloud Shell or maybe even the Azure portal using Microsoft subscription resources. So that's a really good tip for you to be aware of because it covers 2 of those 3 things in my triangle. The subject matter, the theoretical knowledge, and also the hands-on application of that knowledge. Going back to the AZ-301 page, another thing I noticed that Microsoft did for Ignite is that they've embedded appropriate Microsoft Learn modules directly on the page. You see how that works? So up at the top, the AZ-301 Architect Design, if you scroll down past skills measured, under 2 ways to prepare, there's a whole bunch of direct links into MS Learn, which I think is pretty darn nice. What's next? MindHub, yeah. So this hits that 3rd part of my pyramid, test-taking skills. So you've got a leg up or a game plan with your conceptual knowledge and your hands-on skills. How can you be prepared for case studies? How can you be prepared for interactive items, drag and drop? There's only one official Microsoft practice test provider. They're called Measure Up. Anybody familiar with Measure Up? They've been around forever. And what this site is, by the way, I don't work for MindHub or Pearson VUE or any of these companies. Just want to make that clear. What this MindHub is, it's part of Pearson VUE, and it's where I recommend all my students go if you do want to get a Measure Up practice test. If you go there, they've normally got these sales and these bundles going on. And the one you see on the right side of this slide is pretty cool, where you get what's called a Microsoft Exam Replay. You get the Measure Up practice test for, looks like $100 over the list of the exam itself. Well, what the heck is Exam Replay? Have any of you benefited from that before? If you don't know about it, you should. It's a good insurance policy. Because you think, in USD anyway, it's $165 per attempt. So if you don't pass the first attempt, you're bucking up another $165 for your second attempt. The exam replay is essentially a spare voucher. So if you don't pass the first time, they'll send you a second voucher. That'll zero out and allow you to do a free retest. So that's a good thing. And this bundle also gives you, I think it's a 30-day license for the associated measure-up test. Again, those practice tests are invaluable because they help me get into the mindset of how Microsoft is going to assess my knowledge. Because, you don't want to get caught with all that meta stuff. These exams can be stressful. They're time-intensive, they're resource and money-intensive. Ain't nobody got time for that. You don't want to sit there and get distracted by clicking over here. You want to get right to the business and answer the questions and get your badge and go on your happy way. Here's an example measure-up question that I just am putting for our consideration. Every word counts on these items. Remember the tip I gave you earlier? Don't read into the items. Stay with exactly what the text says. What's this saying? You're designing hybrid identity for your org. You've got on-premises AD and an Azure AD tenant. Here are your requirements. Allow a user who logs in to use their local creds to automatically authenticate. Minimize administrative effort. Boy, that's been a chestnut in Microsoft exams forever. You need to set up authentication. What mechanism should you choose? You'll find this is pretty realistic to what's on the live exam. The live exams are not very verbose, which is a good thing. Every word counts. In this case, which mechanism should you choose? What do you think? The third one, I'm hearing single sign-on with password hash synchronization. Right, that's correct. Again, points, study points. Every one of the answer choices, correct, incorrect, will refer to legitimate technologies, nothing fictional. Those are parlor tricks. This is supposed to really assess your knowledge of the subject matter. And Microsoft Learning say that they put these items, every single one, through review after review to make sure every correct answer is 100% correct 100% of the time, and the incorrect distractors are incorrect 100% of the time. Now, that reminds me of something going back to our discussion earlier about the performance-based labs. I just want to tell you a brief little anecdote without further comment, and I'll leave you to do with it what you want. Several months ago or a year ago, whenever it was, I was taking the AZ-103 exam, which is the Azure Administrator test, and sure enough, I expected that there'd be performance-based labs. I already told you the main part of the story. I couldn't complete the labs because I was having problems on that little CRT screen with the floppy disk computer and all that kind of good stuff. So I literally was fully expecting I was going to fail the test because I was unable to complete the performance-based labs. Well, guess what? When I submitted the results, I passed with a very high mark, too. What does that tell you? Microsoft Learning tells you in their documentation that they do put ungraded items in the exams. They seed the exams with ungraded items all the time. It's how they review whether they want an exam item to be graded or not. So I just leave that for your consideration. Next, this is a screenshot from a case study item, not a real one. Another tip, if you've never taken a Microsoft exam yet and you just want to get more of a visual on some of these different interactive items, go to Microsoft Learning's YouTube channel. They have these little 1-minute videos where they go through demos of each of these item types. It can be useful. So this case study is going to involve more reading than the other items for sure, but again, Microsoft has cut down on the verbosity of these. I think they're a good fit for Azure architecture because we're looking at a fictional business, Woodgrove Bank, Tailwind Traders, those Microsoft fictional company names, and they've got some scenario going on, and you click through the tabs to look at their different requirements lists, and then there'll be a subset of 3-5 questions that point back to the case. Here's where the exam strategy comes in. Tip 1, please don't get bogged down on reading and trying to memorize the entire case. Don't do that. Instead, I suggest you scan the case looking for themes, because you're going to find that each case tends to center on one, maybe two, primary themes. And that should get your mind going down a particular path. You might be looking at Woodgrove Bank, for instance, and it comes to your attention, just scanning it, oh, this is mostly about data and server migration. So, okay, I'm thinking of ASR, I'm thinking of database migration assistant and database migration service, so it gets your mind in that channel. So identify theme, then when you go to each question, invariably, each of those questions is going to map back normally to a single bullet point on one of those tabs in the case study. And so you'll map in, find the bullet point, in your mind, map back to the question, and then at that point, really, for all intents and purposes, it's just a multiple choice item. You have everything you need there in order to answer the question successfully. Final note, when you click out of the case study and come back to the main line of the exam, you can't return, but we've already talked about that. So as we're hitting the home stretch here, what happens once you pass the exam? If it's your first Microsoft certification exam, you'll be issued your MCID, your Microsoft Certification ID, that you'll carry with you throughout your career. And you'll be given access to your own certification dashboard, where you'll have your trophy case, in other words, that has your badges. This is showing what happens if you click through into one of your badges. Remember I mentioned that these are eminently shareable. So number one, well, there's expiration. I'll mention that in just a second. But that share link gives you embed codes to make it simple to display your achievement on, say, Twitter, LinkedIn, et cetera. There's just a public URL link that I use a lot if I need to verify to a customer that I have a particular certification. I'll just send them the public URL. And at the top, when they load the public version of your page, there's a verify link that goes through the verification. So that's the idea. It's meant to be a validated achievement. Now, here's an unanswered question for all of us, I think. If any of you have the answer, enlighten us. But all of these role-based certification exams have a 2-year expiry, and you'll see that at the top of the page. Now, of course, the obvious question, I think you'd agree, was, how do we renew? And that's the unanswered question. Seriously. So more will be revealed as we earn our cert and keep it. All right, so marching orders. I've tried to distill and summarize most everything we've learned over the previous hour into a single recipe or formula. And the first step of that is, as I said, to perform a self-appraisal, determining, number one, where are your interests and aptitudes in Azure? Is it mainly administrator, development, or do you want to stay with architecture? What is your balance right now between your hands-on skills and your conceptual skills with Azure? And as I said earlier, what's your best learning style? What kind of training is most efficient and high impact for you? Number two, developing your study plan. Taking the objective domain, putting it into a Word document, an outline, a spreadsheet, whatever, mapping it to a calendar, and with appropriate docs links that you can find online through several kind volunteers. I showed you Microsoft Learn for hands-on practice. And of course, don't forget about looking for a legitimate, and I stress legitimate, practice exam product. Finally, it's passing the exam, which includes finding a delivery method that's best for you, and being proactive, of course, showing up on time, etc., knowing what you're going to need by way of ID and all that stuff, and just get her done. Questions, comments, and closing? Anybody? Well, here's my contact information up here. I want to stay in touch with you. Please don't forget to fill out the eval. Thanks so much for being here, everybody. I'm going to be around if you want to come up.